Beep 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 beep. All right, some Hardwell. Not that I know who that is, or as a Gen Xer, I have no idea if that's like even anybody famous. But today is Saturday, February 25th, and it's rolling up on 9 o'clock, and I like to have my shows out by then. But I kind of keep going on some tangents because I'm talking about psychology and basically how we have an archaic society. And let me try to explain all that. We are what's called a class zero civilization. Just ask Michio Kaku in New York City. He's one of like the most prolific writers of books on physics. He's a physics professor. I think it's City Tech. I'm not sure which one. But he is one of those people that if you watch the Discovery Channel a lot, and I come from a kind of a scientific family. My grandfather was a physicist, and I'm just nerding out on it all the time. I love watching like the physics of Star Trek and stuff like that. And Michio Kaku is one of those guys, one of those professors that's all up in that shit. So he's somebody you're probably familiar with, and if you're not, look him up. It's a great stuff to nerd out to. And he didn't make this up, but he points out that other physicists have that we're class zero. Class zero means that you cannot yet harness the power of a star. And if you think about how much energy is coming out of our star at any given moment, that is a shit ton of energy, and we're not even close. We still have coal-fired power plants. We still, use gas in New York City, where they have these gas turbines. Even though we have Niagara Falls not that far away, but we weren't able to kind of run the wires, so to speak. So energy up in what we call upstate is pretty damn cheap. Upstate and mid-state, but once you get downstate, which is closer to the city, everything is massively expensive. I'm talking like $300 for like a summer month. So I'm down here in Florida. I got this like air cleaner, central air thing going on 24/7. It's comfortable as shit, and I spend about somewhere between 60 and 80. Right? With all the electronics I have now, and my little mini studio, maybe a little more. But I digress. We are, evidently archaic in a lot of ways. One of the ways I look at it is, let's say you open up like a cell phone, and you look at how it's basically pretty flat. You can't really see that many circuits. Mostly you just have kind of a couple of chips on a board. That almost looks kind of magical. If you open up like an old VCR, there was all these like clunky mechanical things, and like, there'd be like rubber belts in it. The heads are like these big metal things. So as things become more advanced, they become more micronized, and they end up kind of fitting on a chip somehow. And you have less, like capacitors sticking out somewhere, and, things look less vacuum tubey. Although those are some, the old vacuum tube amplifiers. Those are, the sound you get out of those is so rich, I gotta tell you. But anyway, but we have a choice, so we could use some of the older technology because of the advantages of it. But what I'm getting at is that at some point when we're class 1, a lot of that stuff is just going to be on like a little wafer-looking thing, like a little black, almost look like a chip, like just the integrated chip. And that'll be like the whole cell phone, and it'll be micronized to a point where, you'd have like an entire cell phone, all its power will fit into like, some little bangle watch. That's hardly anything at all. And you kind of have to press a button for it to like project, just to see anything, because it's not there to display anything. It doesn't have like a screen or whatever. So there are these evidences that we're pretty archaic, right? Okay, that makes sense. So where are we now with psychology? The study of human behavior, and there's a lot of forms of it now: social psychology, evolutionary psych. Um, there are different forms of sociology that look at a lot of human behavior from all these different perspectives. So it's kind of spread out, um, and there's kind of a philosophy behind it, because anytime you have kind of a virgin science, um, which in psychology is only like 100 something years old. So, we're literally talking about the lifespan of some people, and not like a biblical character like Methuselah, but like, some Japanese guy that like, only eats like, ginger root every day, and he lives to be like 130. We're not that far, if you think about it in, more like evolutionary time. We're not that far from wooden ships with sails. The whole idea of having some kind of engine on a ship is kind of a relatively new development. So to think that we're not archaic is a bit silly, that we don't have these holdovers. And we're not, like I said, like somebody would have to kind of see our technology and think it's magic, right? We don't have these like big chunky things that obviously have some sort of, like a rubber belt in a VCR that turns the heads, that reads the tape, like that thing. Those things can be kind of explained to people from, let's say, 500 years ago. You could kind of take somebody in and maybe over the course of a day or two explain to them how we make energy, how we, read the information from the head off the tape. It's something that could be, explained, and people wouldn't think it's magic. But then we get to a point where technology is making technology, kind of like, integrated circuits and the chips that we have. And when somebody from 500 years ago pops up, because, that happens all the time, these damn, time travelers, when it pops up and they say, explain this to me how it's not magic, you just go, it's kind of fucking magic. I don't fucking know, man. It's just, whatever those people do, man, they're sorcerers. Like you almost find yourself agreeing with them, all right? Because you just don't know how to explain it. So it's archaic, and psychology, I think, more so than the other sciences. We always had kind of these natural sciences. We had people who maybe went into alchemy, but at the same time they were doing some work towards what became like the Royal Society in Britain, or the Smithsonian in the United States. The natural sciences. My grandfather was a physicist, and he was head of natural sciences for a couple years in the Smithsonian. That's how my grandparents ended up in Washington, D.C. I always wondered that while my grandmother lived there. Now I know. So we can accept, I think, no one's really arguing with me on this, that we're kind of behind. We're not in the groove yet. We're just kind of starting out with this kind of headed towards a class 1 civilization. Not too long ago, it wasn't even a thought. It was all science fiction. It was all magical. And now, we have surgery, we have hospitals, we have, equipment that reads people's blood pressure and their heartbeat and all that stuff. So we're on some sort of tract, and that I would argue that tract is towards some sort of class 1 civilization, where much of our technology will seem kind of magical. Awesome. It's awesome we're going there, right? Psychology, in the upper echelons of it, is still advancing, and we're figuring things out. But the trickle down to most people is often pop psych, and I define that a little differently. It's not just some, second year psych student popping out some, psychology thing that doesn't really apply to the situation. Pop psych is when you take an old concept and you wrap it in the jargon of psychology and say, kind of like how we wrap accepting Sharia law into, multiculturalism. The same kind of concept, where you're taking something old and saying, oh no, it's like kind of it's the new thing. So it's a little bit dangerous, actually, if you think about it in those terms. But for people who are suffering, it's especially dangerous, and there's a lot of misunderstandings. Even people who are trying to help them, and they mean well, they don't understand sometimes the difference between the psychology they were trained in and the pop psych that's kind of coming from their culture. And you hear things like, people who are depressed are just lazy, or they need to get out and do things, and then they wouldn't be depressed. And that's actually the disease, is that you can't go out and do things. So there's this misunderstanding of what depression actually is, at least for most people. And what usually happens is, one of the things we don't understand is that depression doesn't have to be like a chronic depression. There's actually different names we have for it when it's chronic. We call it a depression. But there are so many people with these chronic depressive disorders that, we say he has depression. But that's not really an explanation, because a depression is supposed to be something that lasts, I think, above 2 weeks, and it's basically all your pleasure in anything you used to like is gone. It's called anhedonia, where you get no pleasure in anything that you used to get pleasure from. That's just gone. Your ability to move can also be gone, literally, like physically, because remember, you're sending a signal to your brain to say do something, right? And you just become less and less capable of sending that signal. Your brain is responsible for your movement as much as your muscles are. So your muscles may be fine and everything is in working order, so to speak, but there's kind of like this chronic fatigue that goes with it, where it's very hard to move, and you could push yourself. And I've been like this, where I've gotten up and I've had to literally drag myself to stick my head in a sink or something to try to wake up, because the depression on that physical level was hitting me so hard. Now I have more of a depressive disorder. Actually, I think I have a panic disorder with agoraphobia, and some sort of depression, NOS, which means not otherwise specified. It's just like an ongoing thing. Sometimes there's a catch-all basket of, depressive disorder, NOS, or mood disorder, NOS, where they just don't really know. They don't have a good definition. So they throw it into this basket. Like I said, they mean well, but they can't really figure it out, because the diagnostic tools aren't the most perfect things in the world. And one of the things that people don't understand is a lot of people are misdiagnosed over and over and over and over again. They can go to anytime they go to some professional, there's a new diagnosis. They're thinking, because their philosophy is, depression is really this. Sometimes you get depression is complex PTSD, which is kind of a lot of the current thinking now. There's a lot of depression and anxiety, actually. And these two things are what are called highly comorbid. When you have a depressive disorder, I think it's something from somewhere from 60 to 80%, you're going to have an anxiety disorder. Why is that? No explanation. Like I said, it's just diagnostics. We go, okay, he has this. There's a percentage chance he has that, and we kind of go based on that. It's kind of like there's no test for Parkinson's, although I've heard there really is. We just don't want to go through the expense. But most Parkinson's patients, when they're diagnosed with it, it's kind of like putting together this kind of diagnostic paradigm and going, okay, that would fit these symptoms. Okay, that's how my father came up with Parkinson's. He just had the symptoms, right? Kind of backwards, but hey, we can't really look into the brain yet as well as we'd like to and figure out what's going on. And there's something called an fMRI, which is functional magnetic resonance imaging. And those are brain scans that some of the ADHD doctors now use if they're from what's called the Amen Clinic. Dr. Amen, he's like one of the big stars of ADHD. And his theory is that there's, multiple forms of ADHD, and it's really about parts of your brain being hyperstimulated and other parts of your brain being hypostimulated. So you have, let's say your frontal lobe is hypostimulated, so you kind of lose some of the functioning that it gives to people. And then you may have, like one of them is called ring of fire. You may have this kind of ring around the side of your brain and the back of your brain. Almost looks like a horseshoe. And all those areas are lit up like fireworks. So you have this kind of like internal thinking, which is just constantly crazy, and you're in like 5 places at once. And it's, pretty crazy making. And these things interact as well. And we don't really understand that either. We like to simplify it diagnostically and say it's depressive, it's anxiety, it's this form of ADHD, and that's it. But we don't go, okay, there's this interaction between these disorders. A lot of these disorders can cause like these huge amounts of muscle tension, especially panic disorder, where you're kind of the muscles are so tense that, let's say you have arthritis or something like that, more of like a physiatric disorder, then that's going to make that a lot worse. And those can come from kind of like injuries at work or in sports, and it causes some sort of physiatric disorder, and things kind of break down from there. So it's very complicated, and we're just not up to that level of complexity yet to look at physical, psychological, neurological, physiatric symptoms and kind of put them together. And it creates a lot of misunderstandings when people are dealing with families that are more in the pop psych thing. They're not educated in the way that they would need to be to help anybody in that situation. And like I'm saying, a lot of the professionals disagree on all of this stuff. But the really big danger with pop psych, or at least my definition of it, is that people kind of wrap these old thoughts in these new, the new jargon of psychology, and they use that to justify some very cruel things, And it's really unfortunate that people would be like, oh, we got to get this guy out to when they're agoraphobic. We got to push him harder or push her harder, and then they'll do more, and then they'll be better. But they have a disease that literally takes away their ability to do that. Like I said, all these misunderstandings that people have, and a lot of those misunderstandings are what they're going through, and their projections on other people, and they don't even understand that those are projections. And I'm sure a lot of you listening are like, what the fuck's a projection? Let's say you have some sort of abuse in your past, and it's like twisted you in some certain way where you can't, maybe you can't have intimate relations, right? You can have friendships and whatnot, but you can't have romantic relations for whatever reason. You respond to the opposite sex with almost like like a panic. Anytime anything gets kind of close to some sort of intimacy, but you could be thinking, because you don't want to admit that you're sick, you could be thinking that intimacy doesn't really exist. You're kind of projecting on everybody else, and thinking or backing up some sort of philosophy that comes literally from your own sickness, from your own abuse. I know that sounds crazy. Or I'm trying to think of like a simpler way to explain projection that would make it really easy to kind of figure out. Something we do all the time, that would go, oh, you mean I'm really projecting? Oh, okay. I'm having a little bit of trouble with that. I'll get back to you on that. But that's a very basic concept that any second year psychology student will be familiar with. But a lot of people either didn't go to college or they didn't take psychology. And it's something that needs to kind of be in our educational curriculum. It needs to be taught. And I think it's more important than higher math, because higher math is something you could take in college if you're going, through a STEM program. But everybody needs psychology. Everybody has people who are fucking crazy in their family. Everybody's pretty much dysfunctional at this point too. So we need to kind of figure out how to integrate that into the curriculum. And that's the only way we can kind of push back against pop psych, the misinterpretations of it. And I know it sounds like you're expecting a lot from people, but believe me, they all have, human brains. And they'll at least get part of it. You at least get to the point where you understand what you don't understand. I know I'm sounding like Rumsfeld saying that, but it's if you get to the point where you understand what you don't understand, that's a good place. Because the people that you're going to deal with, you're at least going to go, I don't want to push them in this way or do that because I don't understand. Right? So you're much less apt to kind of abuse people or to, continuously trigger them or to, and trigger, that's a real word. Again, that's psychology. It's real psychology. I remember I talked about safe spaces and how we were trying to create them when I was in college for people who didn't want to be outed as gay or they didn't want to get beaten up. They didn't want their, cisgender spouse to find out. Because they divorced them or, depending on who, the wife or the husband knew, there'd be some dead people, from that. The people were legitimately in danger, and they are in the Muslim world to a great extent still. Just like we use the term safe space, and it kind of came from psychology, where we're just trying to protect people who are legitimately in danger. We're trying to figure out how to give them an area where they could, meet people, where they could, be open about what they are, who they are, what they're attracted to. The whole concept of triggers is a real legitimate thing that's being misused. Again, it's going pop psych. And it's, think about the guy coming back from war, right? This is where you have kind of the traditional post-traumatic stress disorder where somebody comes back from Iraq or from, whatever battlefield and they saw some horrible shit and they keep having flashbacks of it. They have these things where they kind of go out of where they are now, and they're back in this situation where maybe they saw like a hill of little arms because they chopped off all the children's arms, or like the Apocalypse Now. So like really sick shit. And so these people have flashbacks to these singular events, and they could be multiple events, but it's like a singular. These are single events. No matter how many times it happens, it's Then there's something called chronic PTSD, which didn't make it into the DSM, unfortunately, but it looks pretty legit to me. Makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense to me in my own symptoms, or at least some of them. And that's when you have, like, you're chronically neglected. You're chronically kind of, somebody doesn't have to sit there and say you're worthless. I don't really care about you. I'm not going to protect you. Like if they're your parent and they're the person that's supposed to protect you, they don't have to like sit there and say it overtly. They can just act that way. And it's going to have a tremendous effect on anybody if that's going on during their what's called a critical period when their brain is developing. And now you're kind of taking away their safety, which they're supposed to have, right? You're not supposed to have it in college, but you're supposed to have it as like, a 4-year-old. Or there's different types of abuse where, let's say you're neglected and you kind of know you are neglected and maybe you speak out. Like, why aren't you paying attention to me? And then they flip the script and kind of gaslight you and they make it your fault. Like, oh, you always want attention, you're a baby, And meanwhile, you're like, 7 years old. You are kind of a baby. And they're just forgetting that you're not an adult. And I see these kind of detractions from it in pop psych and in like the colleges, these upper middle class people who, unfortunately, psychology, a little bit of it can make you think you know a lot. And maybe I'm guilty of that. But I've read a lot of books. I actually went through a program. I did like my advanced experimental and stuff like that. So I have a little bit of faith that I know a little bit of what I'm talking about. And I've been personally going through things. A lot of the books I read, like I'll figure out a dynamic and I'll hear about a theory, and then I'll kind of go to the bibliography on an article, and then, I'll actually find the books. That's how I found Dr. Amen with ADHD. So it's a logical progression, which is a phrase I love to use. Anyway, I hope we can at least get to a point where we understand what we don't understand. Where we can see that people aren't helping, our family member or our spouse or whatever's going on, or ourselves. And we could go, you know what, these people are kind of pop psych. They're not really, this professional is not really helping me. I'm being misdiagnosed, I think. And if we have a certain level of education in these things, we could be more like an educated consumer, right? It's just like when you go to a mechanic and you say, yeah, there's this noise. A lot of them go, cha-ching. They have no idea what's going on. I could tell them anything. I could replace all sorts of parts. A lot of times what happens is the mechanic isn't ripping you off. They're just very simple in that they'll literally like... okay, there's a problem with the starter. I don't know how to fix that. I know how to replace the starter. So they'll go and get the starter. You'll spend all this money and you'll have a brand new part and it'll work. And everything will be fine if they did the right thing. But like I said, they only know how to replace a starter. They don't know how to fix one, right? So it's not that they're ripping you off. It's just that, well, they are ripping you off, but they just don't have the know-how. They don't have the real training. They're not really, the kind of mechanic you were looking for. And also, if there's something causing that problem with the starter, the systemic problem, they're not going to get. So they'll just replace the starter, and then later on you'll go through another starter, much sooner than you would have. Of course, they could just be replacing your starter with like a cheap off-brand, or they, popped it out of another car, the junky starter. I hope everybody heard that. My mic was actually like somehow at my neck. Okay. My sound level looks good, so I have that little meter that goes up and down, and it's responding and popping almost into the red. So I assume that you guys are hearing me all okay. God, I hope I don't have like another 3.5 hours of something and then I got to redo it. That's happened to me once. So we have these phrases that come into our, our, let's say, our zeitgeist, because they're being used by professionals and then they're misused by everybody else. Triggers would be one of them. Safe spaces is another one. And I'm not just saying this to attack SJWs. Pop psych causes a lot of harm. People that don't understand what's going on with it, and like Rumsfeld said, you don't understand that you don't understand, can go off on these, what they think is like this heroic helping somebody out, and it's making things worse. Or they could just be the person that triggers them. Sometimes it's not, like I know my stepfather's voice before he passed away. Just hearing it triggered me. Because I grew up being abused by him. So, just hearing his voice was a trigger. And that's a real psychological trigger, right? Sometimes like a general anxiety disorder will turn into a bunch of specific phobias. That goes into the kind of same thing. You're being triggered. Let's say you walk through a spider web and you freak the fuck out because you have more of a general anxiety thing, but it's one of those triggers you have. With a lot of people it's insects, other people it's spiders, some people it's mice. Like they get triggered. And it goes back to some sort of trauma, and it's a real phrase, and it's a real tool, to think about what triggers people, because when we do that, we can kind of remove those triggers, or what's called desensitize them to the triggers somehow. So knowing what triggers somebody isn't just some sort of psychobabble. There's some real diagnostic and reparative points to it. And we kind of, when we pop psych something, we kind of throw that out. We make it almost look stupid and foolish to the point where people go like, oh yeah, let me guess you have a bachelor's in psychologist. Let me guess it's a BS. Knee slapper. And I've heard that. I remember from a Catholic priest. He's like, oh yeah, psychology's bullshit, but he's part of basically a competing psychology religion. So it's no wonder he was against it. But there's kind of like a push when it gets foolish and it gets silly. And then people kind of look at it as just that, foolish and silly. It's not real. They need to get over it. It's water under the bridge. It happened a long time ago. Oh, that's another one I wanted to mention. If something happened during a critical period when you were very young, it's going to stay with you until it's taken care of. It's like that energy is in some part of your body physically. So when we talk about psychosomatic illnesses, like again, another phrase that people really misinterpret, it's not an imaginary illness. It's actually, let's say you're going under like a ton of stress, right? And you have your muscles react to that, like they're always tense, right? So your mind does actually affect your body physically. And not just off brain chemicals, but maybe you're being triggered from a trauma, and now you're in this constant state, and that constant state makes you sick. Maybe it gives you this, like this muscle tension, and God knows what damage that does to you. But it came about because of something psychological, but it's a real thing. But it came about because of that past trauma and something psychological. Now, and kind of, it's kind of thought of as a more like hypochondria, where you're just kind of imagining things. You're imagining that you're always sick, and that's something too. But it's not the same thing. Psychosomatic illnesses are stemming from something that's psychological, but they turn into something real physically. And people think that, like I said, they're just some sort of made up in the head thing. But they're not. That's not like if a doctor looks at, he takes like skin conductivity test, measures your blood pressure and stuff like that, and he sees, holy shit. I remember one time I had my blood pressure taken when I was kind of in an episode, and it was like 120 over 100. And usually I have like perfect blood pressure because I'm kind of vegan, kind of vegetarian. Not completely, a little bit of fish. But so what I was going through was causing this, where they may have wanted, let's say it was 150 over 100 or 150 over 120, they may have wanted to put me on medication for that, right? So, it's like blood pressure could be how it shows up. It could be muscle tension. It could be constant headaches. So it's psychosomatic, but it doesn't mean it's not happening. That's more of a hypochondria. And usually with hypochondria, you think you always have the flu or something, right? Or you have like some disease that causes these symptoms that aren't really symptoms. They're just, there's something that could be kind of made up in your own head. That does happen. I think there was one thing, Better Call Saul, and his brother had something where he thought he was allergic to electricity or microwaves or something weird, right? So he would get like an actual reaction to it, but it would always be precipitated or triggered by, like somebody turned the microwave on and he'd be like, oh, I feel an electric field, and he'd be convinced that he has this illness, and then he would get, you see how this imaginary illness, and then you might be able to, like, your brain and your mind can still kind of cause some symptoms. People will get like rashes because they think they're allergic to magnetic fields, right? With hypochondria, it starts with the imaginary illness that you think you have. Somehow you convinced yourself you have, and then these things happen, and sometimes you're like scratching that area, but your brain kind of leaves out that part. But like I said, it's different from psychosomatic. So there's a lot of misunderstandings we have with people with these disorders. There's a lot of mistreatment. They're given the wrong medication. They're told they have X, Y, and Z when they don't. they're misdiagnosed. I think with bipolar, it usually takes about 10 years for somebody to be diagnosed correctly. 10 years. And we think that you just go to a psychiatrist. They, what do they do? Like take some sage and run around you and smoke you out. And, they read the smoke and they go, oh, it's this disorder. No, they're guessing, right? It's an educated guess, but they're in a lot of ways guessing based on symptoms that have a huge overlap with all sorts of other things. And as we progress, we come up with other ways to describe symptoms, and that's where we come up with complex PTSD. Like with regular PTSD, like I said, you might be a soldier who saw some horrible things, and you'll have these like one, two, or multiple horrible things that you saw, but any one of them could give you flashbacks, can give you these kind of like unconscious reactions where you react very strangely to something, like you see a red car, and that you saw a red car run over a baby, and now every time you see a red car, it's like a trigger. Again, another legitimate use of trigger, and it sets off your reaction, and you start having a flashback, right? With some people with chronic, I call it chronic PTSD, as well as complex, there are things that happened in their past that were just constantly happening. And so, like sexual abuse. So it wouldn't be just, like any one event was already pretty bad, but then, you just have it over, let's say 5 years or 10 years, and it becomes, it really skews your reality. It fucks you up, in layman's terms. And I've heard people say, but that happened a while ago, but let's say you have like a complex PTSD thing going on, and it sticks with you because that's what it does. And you have like the psychosomatic illnesses. In fact, I think if you apply for Social Security, one of the things with anxiety complexes is that there has to be some sort of physical illness stemming from it. Like there's a medically provable disorder that you're going through that's related to your anxiety, or else they don't consider it like a true anxiety disorder. I can kind of see and understand that, because if it's that powerful, it is going to end up being something psychosomatic. Also, people with anxiety disorders get a lot of autoimmune diseases, and that's like highly comorbid with anxiety disorders. And you can look at anxiety, depression, all the mood disorders, and you could see a whole bunch of stuff that's physically related to it, because these psychosomatic illnesses happen. And one of the things is they lay down a framework sometimes, like with self-esteem, sometimes it's non-existent. Sometimes people have, like instead of reacting to a red car, they react to like every car, and it's just like this constant terror that they're in, which I can relate to because that's been a big chunk of my life. And when you take medications, what they do is they calm you down and they take the edge off, but they don't get rid of that underlying stuff that's still happening and that never stopped happening. So you end up like your body goes through all this stress and it's reacting in like the fight or flight, and after a while it just keeps hammering at your body and you get kind of sick in some way. It could be arthritis, it could be psoriasis, it could be a whole host of other autoimmune diseases. It could be like the muscle tension thing that I have, where it kind of works with my spinal injury, and then I get the muscle tension and I lose mobility, right, in my legs for a while. So it's, there are these things that happen that are real. And a lot of times we think of anything in psychology as kind of not being real. And we need to get away from that. We need some sort of basic education in it. And that's all I'm getting at. And I hope if you have any of this stuff that this helped you out. So good night and good luck.